Morning, everyone. It's very nice to be here. My name is Justin McGuirk. I'm an architecture and design critic. And I was invited here to chair this talk today probably because of a series of articles I wrote last year, which were critical pieces about the way that, in a way, a kind of Silicon Valley ethos has infiltrated design rhetoric, design discourse, and asking some difficult questions about the nature of that relationship. So, for instance, I was asking how the language of open design and technology is easily appropriated by the politics of the right. I was asking how economically viable open design actually is, in spite of all this talk about revolution. And I was asking and questioning questioning the countercultural credentials of maker culture. Because for me, open design is, in a sense, the return of utopianism to design culture, moving away from what became embedded in consumer culture. And it is a kind of revolution, but I was keen to kind of situate it as in between revolutions, rather than repeating this kind of ad infinitum, this we're having, it's a revolution. I was kind of questioning it and asking, about the economics, about the politics of it, about the viability of it in general. So, in a sense, I'm kind of an outsider at this conference, as someone who writes about cities and architecture and design more than about technology in the future. And as an outsider, I can see that every conference and every community really has its own jargon. And the jargon I'm aware of here is open, platform, network, participation, smart, all of these words that are quite heavily loaded in a sense. But what strikes me as the most loaded term we're probably going to encounter this week or in the next couple of days is also the one that seems most innocent and most common, and that is make. One of the most common verbs in the English language, make, making. And yet 10 years ago, if you talked about your maker, you were probably talking about God. It was not a very common term. Now, maker culture is seemingly everywhere. Everybody's a maker. This is the kind of new alternative to consumerism, the idea that citizens are engaged, participating. But we're also watching this maker movement be co-opted by the military and the corporate industrial complex. I'm talking about things like O'Reilly Media being funded by DARPA, MakerBot becoming closed source and trying to become a more kind of profit-oriented company, this kind of thing, really the kind of incorporation of a countercultural movement into basic corporate structures. Now, today we're going to be talking about making, and hopefully we're going to get into some of those questions. And with us, we have two prominent members of that community. First up, I believe, who's speaking for? I think it's going to be Golan. Garnet then. Garnet is first. He's an artist and theorist, artist in residence and research scientist at UC Irvine. I came across him because he produced a handmade 350-page volume called Critical Making, which is really probably the significant volume on making. And we also have Golan Levin, an eminent artist and software engineer. He teaches at Carnegie Mellon University, and I came across him with his Neolicida, it's not really a camera, is it, but optical device, which he launched on Kickstarter last year, and got something like 30 times the funding that he was looking for at nearly $500,000, so that was quite an achievement. I'm going to let them talk, they're going to present, and then we're going to have hopefully a 15-20-minute conversation afterwards, which we would very much like you to join in, so keep your questions in mind. Garnet, over to you.
Thanks. Okay, so my name is Garnet Hertz. I am going to talk about making and some of my work. I grew up in a rural part of Canada, there, Saskatchewan, which is sort of a kind of a place where there's lots of snow, far north, it's kind of where Santa Claus lives and all the rest of that. And grew up in a rural environment where This is the farmhouse that I spent time growing up on as a kid. It didn't look like this when I lived there. This is a after-the-fact picture. But I grew up in these environments, and I had an uncle who would DIY together different farm contraptions. And this has kind of served as a cornerstone to me in my work as an artist and researcher. So early on, this is 1994, I built a internet-controllable machine that you could draw on a floor, disassemble televisions, made very small computers, did stuff related to galvanism and put a computer inside of a frog specimen, cockroaches with video backpacks, insect-controlled robot that scurries around and has light sensors that look in front of it, and the cockroach navigates around the robot. And a driving arcade cabinet that actually goes down the road and has a custom vision system that looks in front of the car that tries to turn the real world into an 8-bit version of reality. Trying not to hit children. It's actually incredibly scary to drive. And other imaging projects and stuff related to hardware and electronic art. So I want to focus on one particular project called Critical Making. This was the result of me wanting to take the idea of DIY and maker culture and bring it into conversation with other things that I had learned in different design disciplines, art disciplines, and critical theory. And it actually started with me thinking about Make magazine, which was mentioned in the introduction. Make magazine is really interesting. Does anybody here know of Make magazine? Raise your hands. Okay, some good amount of people. It's a fantastic magazine, okay? But it's skewed toward a particular segment of the DIY kind of market, okay? So I thought, well, how could there be an alternative to Make magazine? What would it look like? So I started by photoshopping up kind of a parody of Make magazine. And I don't know if you can read this, but it says, join the Arduino revolution, but avoid civil disobedience. Open source secret revealed. Everybody just buys the kit. 101 DIY gadgets for white males. How to use a MakerBot to make a 3-cent piece of plastic. So I started to think about this. And also there's a lot of other terms that I was aware of. Critical making, critical design, adversarial design by Carl DeSalvo, critical engineering, critical technical practice by Phil Agre, tactical media, lots of stuff like this that really wasn't within the cluster of what usually gets termed as maker culture. So I really like this term critical making. And this term critical making comes from Matt Ratto, who's at the University of Toronto, and he had used it to describe a style of work that combines critical thinking and critical theory with maker practices. So what I did is I took a back of an envelope, wrote down sort of a dream team of people that I thought would be contributors to this. I tagged things like, Dun and Raby, Natalie Jermenjenko, Chris Csikszentmihalyi, a lot of people that I knew, a lot of people from academia or the media arts, posted it on Facebook, tagged their names, and people started actually sending me stuff. It was kind of surprising. So, and a lot of these people were from academia, from digital humanities, and what I did is I asked people to submit a 2-page piece of content to me. And what was interesting here is that these are people who, for the most part, are kind of like mainstream, large institution academics. And they sort of went crazy with this kind of format of publishing stuff in a non-paper kind of way. This is Scott Snibbe, the media artist, talking about his childhood through photos. Sex-related stuff that would never be in Make a magazine. Historical stuff from the Molinas. Stuff in different languages that wouldn't be included. Cree++, the idea of a programming language that comes from an Aboriginal North American language that has a very different concept of things and objects. Design fiction. Julian Bleecker. Albert Borgman, a philosopher of technology, sent me this, fax scanned. Stuff dripping with color. All sort of different formats, and people really sort of embrace this idea of kind of almost like a throwback to zine publishing, not tagging it up and publishing it at Kai or SIGGRAPH or something like that, but really sort of having fun with publishing format. Stuff in ugly fonts. Or people who wouldn't normally be included in a discussion on making. And so 70 people ended up submitting stuff. I got tape and scissors together in a kind of a punk skate magazine, zine kind of style, copied it. It was absolutely horrendous. I folded and stapled paper for a month. And I made 300 copies of these things and distributed it to friends and people that I knew and gave it to libraries, and it sort of spread from there, and I'm on the stage here talking about it. So it worked out pretty good. So what I wanted to do next, then, is to come back to the main question of what's the maker movement? How do we understand it, and what can we take away by bringing together critical theory, design, electronic art, kind of informing and thinking about the maker movement, or what are my opinions about it? I think a big thing about the maker movement is that it can really be summarized as kind of this promise of the Arduino, 3D printing, and open source. And not that this is necessarily bad, it just, at times, it gets to be kind of like a little bit like cultish. And if anybody's used a 3D printer, you'll know that it may change the world, but doesn't have all the promise that it promises. It doesn't have all the delivery that it promises. Also, another way to think about it is the maker movement is kind of like a folk art for engineers. It's a way for, and I don't say this in a condescending way against folk art or engineers. I think one of the values of the maker movement is that it brings creativity to a discipline where people wouldn't normally be exposed to creativity in the artistic kind of sense. Not to say that engineering's not creative, but so, for example, devices like this that they're kind of like it's kind of like a one-liner, and I kind of think of this as like folk art for nerds, and it's fun, but it's not the most conceptually deep kind of thing, It's a gadget for the sake of being a gadget. One of the things, though, that I think that the maker movement can be commended on is that it understands the value of physical things. And a few references come to mind. If you haven't read Richard Sennett's The Craftsman, it's a great book that goes into this in some depth, the real sort of like therapeutic and human value of working with your hands. This is something that the maker movement really understands and really works with and has to its strength. You could also maybe think of this as neo-materialism, which is another term that's being thrown around lately, or the post-digital. And I think the value in understanding physical objects is that often, or just technology in general, often technology is a black box in the center, like your iPhone. You don't really know how it works. There were, 50 PhDs that spent 100 person years developing that black box of magic, and it's kind of a mystery. You just use it, you see the input go in, you have the input go out, and it's a mystery. So I think the value of understanding objects and technologies is that this expert territory is kind of invaded by people who use the term makers. And it's bent and reappropriated and mixed up in typically non-expert ways. And I think this is a valuable thing. But in the shift, I see a particular shift from the concept of a maker, concept of a hacker, kind of being around 2004, really shifting into this idea of a maker. So from hackers to makers. And in that transition, there's a number of things that got dropped out. Now, makers and hackers aren't exactly the same, but one thing definitely that makers don't have that hackers, or you could even say artists or other people, is controversy. So you have, the idea of hacking with, Edward Snowden, or making a cigar box guitar. And cigar box guitars are great. It's just that they're different. So I think that's interesting to think about the difference between hacking and making. In addition, you also see the terms hacker spaces and maker spaces being used. They're collaborative environments where people huddle around a 3D printer usually, or a laser cutter, and work on projects together. Very similar to a shared studio, shared artistic studio, or shared technical shop. Now, hacker spaces, I think it's worth pointing out that I see some difference in the usage of these terms. Hacker spaces tend to be anarchistic and into things like information security, lockpicking, and this sort of stuff. And maker spaces are a much more kid-friendly kind of environment. And I'm not saying that the hacker spaces or maker spaces are one is better than the other, just that I think those terms are interesting to sort of look at and compare. But one thing that the hacker, that's kind of lacking out of the idea of the hacker is that makers definitely seems more gender inclusive than hackers. And I think this is a positive thing I don't know if you're keeping score, the positives for the makers versus hackers. The computer science field actually was very dominated, or had a very active community of women initially. And eventually, there's several different graphs about this, but in the 1980s, the participation of females in computer science started to really trail off. And I've heard people equate this to the rise of the term hacker. Now, I'm not an expert in this term, or in that particular trend, but I think that's interesting, and I think there's probably some validity there. Hacker being very male-oriented kind of concept. But So then there's obviously other terms like craft. But making is kind of like where you put it together and you're kind of like not so concerned how it, like the fit and finish of it. Sort of like a quick hack, kludgy, makeshift type of approach. So it lacks this type of craftsmanship of craft practice. And I don't know if you can read that on the bottom. This is a show at the V&A curated by Daniel Charney, Power of Making, the Importance of Being Skilled. And this is something that is often lacking in the discussion around making. What is the role of finish and craft? So intricately built things tend not to be the strong point of the maker movement. You could also think of it as kind of the popularization of a lot of electronic art practice. And without the context, for better or for worse, without a lot of the baggage that's there, which is good and bad. And it's strange because the maker movement is very excited about microcontrollers and Arduinos, which is basically like a computer from the 1980s, right? It's like the new media, but it's old, right? So these projects from the 1970s are basically things that very much resemble, in this case, the Apple I, I think resembles an Arduino in a lot of ways. And I see that the maker movement is sort of at a place where it's professionalizing, and it could go in several different paths, or the practitioners in that field could choose to go into an artistic kind of angle, more design kind of angle, or into a commercial angle. And a problem, and also benefit, is that the maker movement is focused on delivering and not speculating and not imagining and not conceptualizing. It's sort of like I make, therefore I am. And it's very instructional versus being very conceptual. Also, there's interesting things that are emerging internationally in terms of the maker movement. One point is the sort of cultural ideas around openness and manufacturing, open hardware, and openness. And I think it's interesting to see how Chinese manufacturing culture, in a lot of ways, could be thought of as being very open source, not in a conventional kind of Western concept. And I think this is something that the maker movement can think about. And in a lot of ways, MakerBot, the 3D printing company, is like Apple. And in a lot of ways, or a lot of other companies that just start up kind of as a rough prototype. I think it's kind of nice that these are both in wood, both hacked together in garages sort of thing, and then professionalized into a black box, proprietary, you know. I mean, the Apple I was never, I don't think, open source. Apple has always been closed source, but it's kind of poetic that it's turned into a black box. And in closing, like I mentioned before, the maker movement is very rapidly being institutionalized. And this is normal. So aligning and getting funding from military sources. Being mentioned by President Obama in, a State of the Union address. Raising lots of substantial money on Kickstarter. You're seeing a professionalization of the field where this sort of like fun environment of do-it-yourself is sort of in a teenage kind of years where it's really growing into an adult. And that's it for my talk. So thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Garnet, and I'm really honored to be here. It's a pleasure to be here finally for Future Everything. Can you guys hear me okay? Thanks. So my talk today exists as kind of an illustration of some of the things that Garnet talked about. I'm a new media artist and a software engineer and a professor at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, and today I'll be talking about some of my projects in the area of critical making. I don't really care too much about how we peg them, but they are in this kind of space of a reflective consideration of the maker culture and how it allows people to work in new ways. Everything I'll be showing today, which are these three different projects of mine, are themselves tools that enable other people to make things in new ways, but in so doing, hopefully prompt some kind of critical reflection on the part of those people who use them. So all of these projects that I'll show today are free or low-cost tools designed to empower everyday people to discover their potential as creative actors. And they each represent prompts towards critical thinking about material culture, about advertising, and about education, respectively. So I'm going to begin with this project called, I'll get to it. It's called the Free Universal Construction Kit. It comes as inspired by the needs of my son. You all know these. These are the sort of construction kits that we're all familiar with. And they each individually allow for infinite recombinations of form. Or do they? Each one in its own way presents a universe that's sort of self-contained with no wormholes from one universe to another. And what really sort of is intimated by systems like this is that each company would prefer that their kit be your only kit, and the others are just sort of elephants in the room. So this happened.
What were you trying to do?
I'm trying to connect this into here and then make it like a car and connect this then there.
But okay, this is what kind of toy? This is what kind?
Connects.
And what's the other one?
Finger toys.
And do they fit together?
No, my thing is that I'm trying to make a car that is kind of like this.
So wait, so what's this kind here?
Zoom. So
you're trying to connect what to what?
this to this to this.
So that's three different systems. Do they fit together?
That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Oh, that's a problem, huh?
Yeah.
So this is indeed the problem, and today's manufacturers have little or no intrinsic motivation to make their products compatible with anyone else's. Bruce Sterling calls this the formation of the stacks. You've got the Microsoft stack and the Apple stack and the Google stack and the Facebook stack and the Yahoo stack. And they're not necessarily very easily compatible. And indeed, despite obvious benefits or potential benefits to users everywhere, the implementation of cross-band or cross-brand interoperability can be nearly impossible, given the very tangled restrictions of patents, design rights, and trademarks involved in doing so. Well, so we stepped up. And we started to reverse engineer, my student Sean Sims and I, commercial toys. And we first tried to use calipers. They're accurate to a hundredth of an inch. It failed. We moved on to micrometers, which are accurate to a thousandth of an inch. It failed too. And finally, we learned about this thing called the optical comparator. Here it is, magnifying a bristle block tremendously, which is accurate to a 10,000th of an inch. And we used this as a way of very precisely reverse engineering each of these different toy systems. And we created from there the Free Universal Construction Kit. which is a matrix of 76 adapter bricks that enable complete interoperability between 10 different popular children's construction toys. By allowing each and every piece to mate with any other, the kit encourages totally new forms of intercourse between otherwise closed systems, enabling radically hybrid constructivist play and the conception of heretofore impossible designs. And as with other grassroots interoperability remedies, the Free Universal Construction Kit implements proprietary protocols in order to provide a public service unmet or possibly even unmeetable by corporate interests. Crucially, we've released our designs as a set of free 3D models that people can download. They're in the wild, and anyone with a desktop 3D printer can download these files and print a copy for themselves. They actually work. And there's even a universal adapter brick, sort of speculative more object, which connects all the systems together. So for me, this project represents this notion of reverse engineering as a civic activity or even a civic duty in which everyday people are creating local solutions to local problems and potentially creatively overcome the limitations of mass media. And in a sense, not just mass media, but specifically material culture as it's defined by corporate mass production. Okay, so there's one approach. These objects prompt critical reflection on the world, hopefully, but also enable people to become empowered in some way, people like my kid. And most importantly for me, the Free Universal Construction Kit is not just a gift to my son, but it's actually a kind of a metaphor for how all things should work, I hope. This is why VLC is made by Bulgarian hackers and allows you to load QuickTime files and also Windows Media files, right? Microsoft and Apple couldn't get it together, but a bunch of folks in Bulgaria did. My next project is concerned with the impact with which information visualization can contain or can obtain when it's freed from the predictable frame of the newspaper business section into the realm of the commons. Basically, what happens when information visualization meets graffiti? Why don't we see information graphics more in public space? These two languages don't usually collide, but they should. Messages of protest should be backed by data. And this is especially important in an era in which people have such a weak grasp of numbers that matter. So I'm very interested in combining the visual language of data visualization with the communication strategies of urban markup. These typologies are by Ben Fry and Richard Brett. So I'll begin with a small project by a student of mine. She's a first-year student, Madeline Varner. And it consists of a set of free downloadable stencil designs, which are available through the website of the Free Art and Technology Lab, or the FAT Lab. And it's she wanted to know, she had questions like, how do I know which bathroom stall is gross? Does this water fountain taste bad? Will I get splashed if I stand at this bus stop? Which park bench has the best view? Which tree is the best one for naps? And so she produced these stencils. It's called 5-Star Graffiti. And it's designed for in situ rating visualizations on a classic 5-point scale. So it's particularly good at adapting the visual language of Foursquare and Yelp to all sorts of public services and natural phenomena, such as bus stops, park benches, drinking fountains, and trees. Now, we've always been confronted by corporate messaging in cities, but recently advertising has taken a particularly dehumanizing turn, intended for reading by machines, or even more specifically, turning us into appendages for machines for reading them. And there seems to be no place for everyday people to make their voices heard in this amidst the robot barf of QR codes. By contrast, I'm inspired by a phenomenon from the U.S. called hobo codes, which became widespread in the early part of the 20th century. And these were these forms of civic markup used by vagabonds and migratory workers as a way of cluing the precariat into cluing them into good situations and warning them about bad ones. These are these kind of codes that they would write in chalk or in charcoal on the sides of buildings or street signs and so forth. And they would say things like, talk religion, get food here, or a kind lady lives here, or watch out for the bad dog, or there's a man with a gun. And they're still in use today, actually. You can still find them. Those on the right are from New York City from about 5 years ago on Canal Street. Love them or hate them, I wanted to put QR codes into the hands of everyday people. And now stencils are a very fast way of doing that. It's a fast way that everyday people can make very large and importantly, highly accurate images at any scale. But QR codes themselves present unique problems for stencils because of the islands of isolated material that pop up in unpredictable places. So I developed some free software that makes it easy for everyday people to make their own QR code stencils. My software uses a simple computer vision technique to automatically bridge these islands that would otherwise make stencils so tricky to design and fabricate. So anyone with a laser cutter or who has access to a laser cutter service can then use the software to make these. And I've released the software with a set of 100 sort of ready-made QR hobo codes, which are a set of urban covert markup tools for digital nomads. These ready-to-cut designs port a number of classic hobo annotations to the QR format, such as turn right here, dangerous dog, food for work, as well as some new ones that are specific to contemporary situations, insecure Wi-Fi, hidden cameras, vegans beware, no changing table, bad coffee, has electrical outlets, caveat emptor. And once again, this is a kind of situated information visualization in which information is tightly coupled to its context by civic concerns, driven by civic concerns and conscience. I see these graffiti infovis systems as a form of design for criticality in that they provide a new channel by which everyday people can share and exchange opinions on their environment. It's perhaps more accurate to say that they piggyback pre-existing channels of communication. And in this way, I also offer the project as an example of critical design insofar as it offers a critique and a fix for the ways in which machine-driven public messaging has until now been completely unidirectional. This is not a project by me, but it's another example I like of information graffiti, and it treats the commons in a different way. And instead of thinking about the commons as buildings, it's actually the currency, which is passed around between people. Created by an anonymous artist collective, the project's called Occupied George, and it occupies U.S. currency with rubber-stamped infographics in order to widely disseminate information about the problem of income inequality. It's called Occupied George, as I mentioned, and it reaches people precisely where and when they're thinking about money in the sort of portable architecture of our economy. And at the top, you can see how, for example, the richest 400 people in the United States earn the same as the poorest 150 million. So this is a project of rubber stamps where they distribute these rubber stamps for free online, and you can download the thing, make a rubber stamp yourself, and basically sort of start publishing these messages on currency that you then redistribute back out into the commons. Okay, my third and last project. I have a lot of art students at Carnegie Mellon who believe that realistic drawing equals good art. And sometimes it does. But their notion comes from what's probably a really dilapidated art education system in the United States and really conventional notions of what art is. Art equals good drawing equals art. And this is probably usually because it's kind of hard to do. But this proposition has proven surprisingly durable in spite of nearly 2 centuries of photographic technology and optical progress, having made drawing in certain respects obsolete. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Hockney-Falco hypothesis, but David Hockney, the artist, about 12 years ago, proposed in his book Secret Knowledge that the great masters to whom we ordinarily ascribe these sort of mystical powers given on from heaven of being able to draw like no one has been able to ever draw since. Hockney's thesis was actually that in various sophisticated ways and secret ways that they never revealed, they used optical technologies like prisms, mirrors, lenses, and so forth in order to assist them in making accurate reproductions of from life. And there's actually a lot of evidence to support this. I recommend the book very highly, but it's a very controversial book that really pisses off some curators I know. They get real mad about it because it kind of suggests that the great masters, they think it suggests that the great masters maybe weren't so great, that they were human after all. I actually think it's actually even better than that. I think it suggests that the great masters were even greater because they engaged with the leading technology of their day, optics, and in the sort of the classic tradition of a new media artist, they would go out and find whatever techniques they needed to sort of stay ahead of the game. The argument would be that in the early 1600s, a concave mirror might cost the equivalent of $40,000, like a year's income. And the critique is, well, how could they possibly have gotten this? And I'm like, I know artists who'd spend that on a laser cutter if it kept them ahead of the curve. Plus, in many cases, the patronage system was such that the same people who were funding the scientists who were inventing the concave mirrors were also the same people who were the patrons of the artists. So there's a kind of an indirect channel one can imagine this happening. Anyway, this was fascinating to me, and it seemed to me that my students needed to learn about this in a way. So I started a project with my friend Pablo Garcia, which was about resuscitating a device invented by an Englishman, William Hyde Wollaston, in 1807, called the camera lucida. It hasn't been manufactured in a century, but it's a small device that allows you to trace what you see using a kind of a mirrored prism. I'm going to show our most recent video that kind of explains the project.
The Neolucida is an optical drawing aid that lets you trace what you see. It's a modern reinterpretation of the camera lucida, an indispensable drawing tool popular in the days before photography. So how does it work? Clamp your Neolucida to a table, locate the prism over your paper and in front of your subject. Look down into the prism, and you will see your hand and the ghost image of your subject at the same time, and you trace what you see. But wait, trace what you see? Is that cheating? Well, that's what a lot of people thought when the artist David Hockney proposed that the great masters of art may have used optical drawing aids in creating their masterpieces. Drawing aids like lenses, mirrors, and the camera lucida. As two art professors, we weren't interested in making a product. We thought about asking a provocative question. What if we could give a camera lucida to artists, historians, and students? What if people could decide for themselves if Hockney was right? The problem is that camera lucidas are antiques and priced accordingly. So we figured we'd make our own inexpensive version. We decided to crowdfund it, to pay for the minimum order of 500 custom prisms. We would make the small batch as an experiment and then move on. After all, how many people would want an obsolete device few had ever heard of? Despite the overwhelming response, we still think of this as a provocation. While the Neolucida is just a prism on a stick, the Neolucida project is much more. It's an exercise in working with crowds, because it's crowd-funded. It's crowd-empowering because we share knowledge through open-source design. We give free downloads for 3D print files so you can make your own parts. It's crowd-learning because we discuss and debate the relationships between art and technology throughout history with tens of thousands of people. And it's a crowd laboratory because people share their modifications and new applications for the Neolucida. And it keeps us busy. We go out and do lectures and workshops and learn from people as they adapt the tool for their needs, as they show us how they're learning to see and draw the world.
So, as I hope it's clear, we did a Kickstarter, and it went viral, much to our surprise. And a lot of people became interested in this. We ended up using the Kickstarter kind of in a kind of a subterfuge. Our goal was to get as many of these camera lucidas out there to the public as cheaply as possible, and to do so as a provocation, not as an entrepreneurial project, not to make money, but rather to kind of to screw with art education. Our reckoning was that if our art students and if art students like ours could experience this, it might prompt them into just reconsidering this kind of unexamined assumption they had about, realistic drawing being this very, very difficult thing. And so, like I said, it went viral, and suddenly we were put in the position of making these things. And we learned a lot. Kickstarter is, I think, something that, alongside the maker movement, facilitates produces a new economy within which people can prospectively offer things to a crowd and cut out huge numbers of middlemen and other kinds of systems and just kind of directly reach an audience. This is maybe, alongside the Arduino and the 3D printer, one of the, I would add to Garnet's slide, about one of the things that I think really constitutes the maker movement is this ability to suddenly reach micro audiences, or even sometimes unexpectedly so, major audiences. So one of the things we did with the Neo Lucida Kickstarter was we actually released a set of course materials in the course of doing the Kickstarter, which were these lessons on media archaeology, and very specifically about the relationship of art and technology, drawing and optics, as a way of kind of educating the people who were investing in our project. So just a couple pictures of how it turns out. Here's a drawing. Here's what it actually looks like through the optical component of the Neo Lucida as Pablo is tracing some flowers. Lots of people used it, and many people posted images online very enthusiastically about the kinds of things that they were making with it. And we began to see across 11,000 people, actually 15,000 because we had a few extra to sell, the kind of prompt we wanted to happen of people reconsidering what it meant to draw realistically. So I want to talk about what happened. I haven't really talked about this before. And how I now conceive of the Neo Lucida project. On the one hand, it's what I would call a critical design project. It's a product as provocation. It's a working tool that allows people to actively question widely unexamined assumptions and values in art history and education directly themselves by enhancing their own creative potential. It's also a testament to the success in a certain way of the systems which scaffold the maker movement. You'd call it a maker success. We were, for a time, for a few months, in the top 100 most funded Kickstarters of all time, out of approximately 100,000 Kickstarters. And crowdsourcing economies in particular, it really highlights how a couple guys could, just be able to reach a lot of people. And yet, it's also something a lot more complicated, and about which I have very ambivalent feelings, and that are not resolved for me. Because although it looks like, me and Pablo kind of going out and like reaching an audience directly, there's actually a huge back end to this thing that immersed me in some pretty interesting stuff. Here's our factory in Dongguan, where we ended up making these things. On the right is the main factory building. It's got separate floors for, on the bottom, injection molding, painting, and then assembly happens on the middle floor. And on the left is the dormitory where all the factory workers live, 2 to a room. Our particular factory makes a lot of toys. The plastic toys you see everywhere. Not toys that I really like very much. Here's the assembly line next to ours with these ice cream assembly kits from some other company. And here's our assembly line. Kind of give you a quick run through it. Of about half a dozen people kind of working to assemble this stuff. Here are the 10 men and women who worked for us for 2 weeks to make 15,000 Neo Lucidas. They're holding cards in which they've written their names. They work 6 days per week for 11 hours a day for $1.50 an hour. It's about £1. They tell me that this is considered a good job and that ours is one of the best factories in Dongguan. And even so, it's mind-numbing work, and I can't even begin to describe the ecological toll, in addition to the toll that it evidently takes on them. Here's one, Pan Huaihui, who's at work assembling the eyepieces. It is a very highly consultative process, except when we leave the room, and then they work on the lines. And I tried it myself, and I can tell you there's absolutely no way I could keep up with them. It was almost comical, like Charlie Chaplin in the modern times. I mean, my inbox kept like piling up way faster than I could process it. They're pretty amazing how they work. Turn that down. This was the assembly line next to ours, and I just kind of recorded this for a while. Maybe the thing I'd like to impress on you, and I don't have a takeaway from this, is just, while it looks like I'm the maker who's kind of, being the artist, I mean, there's a whole system in back of this that involves a lot of people and huge systems that aren't really different from what the toy manufacturers are doing, very large companies. And I don't know how it's a mixed feeling to say that I'm now like right alongside a big toy company. That's a strange place to be. Maybe the last thing I'd like to impress on you that I learned is that all of our stuff, all the basic stuff that you're touching every day, all your clothes, all your cameras, all your physical things, your toys and so forth, is handmade. And that may not even sound like it makes sense. And you'll see lots of sexy videos online produced by Apple, where they show the highly automated looking processes by which their computers are manufactured with robots picking and placing everything. But even so, even when there's a lot of automation and tools and so forth, there's a ton of handwork in there. And there's hundreds of people that touch everything you do. And I think my eyes were really open to seeing how many other people's hands could get involved, even in a small project like this one, just for a small number of people. You look at this and you see the assembly line, but I really see the hands now and the people behind them. I have like an hour of this. We can just let it go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Yeah. Thanks, Golan, and thanks, Garnet, too, for two very, highly engaging and fascinating presentations. We have a few minutes for questions and for audience discussion, too, but I'll kick it off. Garnet, you were talking about how maker movement is, on one sense, it can be seen as folk art for engineers. Mm-hmm. And you were joking, but on the other hand, there's a real insight there. And there's a tension between that definition of the maker movement and this kind of high-flown rhetoric of the so-called Third Industrial Revolution that gets published all the time and that politicians are now advocating. You were talking about how hacks get professionalized into black boxes. So I suppose the question is, does it matter that culture gets institutionalized, corporatized, or do you see it as kind of beneficial that somehow all of this gets simply fed into industry?
I think... Is my mic on? Yeah. I think that definitely the recession in the United States can be linked to an uptake of America and lots of Western countries trying to figure out what manufacturing is, and a real push that has really aided the maker movement. And has been really sort of influential in helping it become more aligned with different institutions.
You're talking about politicians basically rediscovering the idea of made in America.
Made in America, yeah, and it's often put in opposition to China, for better or for worse, and it's usually draped in an American flag. It often is.
So the maker movement as nationalism?
There is an aspect to that, definitely. I think Make Magazine has definitely capitalized on that, and so has MakerBot. It's all made in Brooklyn, New York City.
I should just point out to the audience that what we're looking at here is Critical Making, the book that Garnet was talking about earlier. Golan, let me move to you. On the same topic, really, you said reverse engineering is a civic duty, and there are big questions about the maker movement in terms of its accessibility to the kind of populace at large. There's a sense, especially with things like open design, that it is kind of limited to a certain expertise, that you're a software engineer and you can do these things, but your average person just wants, to buy something. Do you think that open design and these aspects of maker culture are genuinely accessible, or do you think it's always going to be a kind of niche market?
So, that's one of my projects. So, I think there will naturally always be people who have, more engineering skill than others. The question is how that's articulated in culture now. When I said reverse engineering is a civic duty, it's for people who can do it at whatever level they can do it at. And what happens is, yes, I don't expect everyone to become a top-flight reverse engineer, hacking protocols and cracking file systems and so forth. But what I hope happens, and I think I'm seeing this more and more, is people who can engineer or reverse engineer who release open hardware, open source plans, and make it easier for everyday people to either make things or adapt things. And I think we do see this happening with the artists and designers who've designed, for example, the Arduino, and the huge culture of people who are now able to make things because of the rising tide of abilities that they've enabled to happen. A project right now that I can't get out of my mind is called Open Source Ecology by a Polish-American fellow, Marcin Jakubowski. And he's made this thing called the Global Village Construction Set. It's a set of 50 machines which are a starter kit for civilization. And they consist of things like a tractor and a bread oven and a vehicle and a bicycle and other kinds of farm equipment, which, if the power grid went out suddenly and, for example, a Carrington event or something like that, fried power grids everywhere, whatever it might be, that you could have these plans for 50 machines that from a single DVD or from a single book of plans, one could sort of reboot civilization. And he's working on creating these plans so that for using local materials and using the simplest possible sort of interchangeable parts, your bread oven could use the same parts as your tractor, and you could rapidly restart civilization in the case of some kind of catastrophic failure. It's a typical paranoiac American project, but it's also got a lot of sense to it, and he's releasing the plans for these 50 machines open source. Yes, it takes a ton of engineering work to figure out a way that you can have interchangeable parts between a bread oven and a tractor, but once you've released those plans, you don't need as much skill in order to follow them.
So are you advocating a kind of a movement of mini Snowdens, kind of releasing industrial closed secrets so that this can all be... I mean, that's different because he engineered those himself, but I mean, in terms of reverse engineering, would you like to see people kind of stripping away or stripping out the code and releasing everything to the public?
I think we see this anyway because, I mean, as the stacks consolidate, and I'm using Bruce Sterling's term for these large companies that have stacks of services that are only compatible with their own services within that stack. You also see, open source engineers and Snowden types occasionally, or simply just hackers who get together to kind of to repair this. It's a cat and mouse game, and it gets harder and harder sometimes. But I think that it's inevitable that will happen. We can distinguish between what Snowden did, which is really opening our eyes to a whole bunch of stuff that's going on behind the scenes, to just making the world work more effectively. You can also distinguish between engineering and reverse engineering. But I absolutely see, for me, the maker movement not as being one of American nationalism, made in America or something like that, but rather about pushing the idea of local economies. I pulled a slide at the last minute of Jane Jacobs, who's a hero of mine. In her book, The Economy of Cities, she talks about how the healthiest cities are the ones which can, to the greatest extent possible, meet their own needs. And whether it's through local agriculture or through local manufacture. We've lost that in a lot of cases. And I think that the maker movement in all of its different manifestations, both critical and non-critical, portend a world in which we're going to have more skills to rely on locally.
Thank you. The bell has rung, but I think it would not be fair to let the audience not join in. So if we can take one or two questions before we break for lunch, that would be really great. We've got one over there, and we've got one over there. If we can pass the microphone to them.
Hello. I was wondering, in the beginning of the talks, there was mention of all of the kind of critical makers existing within academia, and I would say also most of my favorite artists survive within that space as well. And I was wondering what the response has been within the more broader maker community to the idea of critical making, and are there any kind of tangible responses as of yet?
That's a good question. I mean, in terms of the maker community, there's been... the term critical making is quite kind of a niche term. And although we have a big audience in the room here and we're talking about it, it's still a relatively small term. And people use different terms, and I'm not necessarily wanting to force that brand on anybody. But when I talk to people and show them the project or show them the zines and discuss these things with them, there's a lot of interest. And I get invited to speak about this at different maker fairs or different events, go to hacker spaces and stuff like that. And there's a great diversity in terms of what people are doing that fall under the banner of makers. There are artists, there are people who just do it on the weekend or evenings, and there's a big selection. So I've had a strong response to this project, and I think it just kind of gave a banner for people to kind of understand and just to acknowledge a different thread of work that's already happening.
Sure. There's been some interesting blowback recently to the speculative design movement. Heroes of mine like Don and Raby and Auger Loiseau and even the critical making sort of perspective that I love, that it's really coming from a position of privilege. And I actually know some very good hacker-maker types who are like, you know what, I just want to fix this freaking thing that broke, okay? And for them, it's about that. And so there's a lot of skepticism about this. I think that what the critical making movement has pointed to here is just kind of to ask the legitimate question, what's worth making and why, when we see some ridiculous gizmos that are clearly the product of superfluity, of just people with excess time on their hands. I think you can detect some millenarianism here, I think as we approach an era of scarcity and social change and, environmental change and so forth, that's going to apply pressure onto the entire world in new ways, such that what's worth making and why will probably become much more apparent on its own. And people will really focus on problems at hand. And these kinds of skills that people have will definitely come in handy for that.
Thank you. And we had one more question, if we can briefly deal with that.
You both mentioned, I think, a similar thing, interoperability of different systems, and then the idea of things being a black box, and that they are issues. But I'd wonder if you could comment more on, I mean, you kind of mentioned them as issues per se or implicitly, but what actual, day-to-day problems in a very mundane sense, those, that interoperability or that black boxing really presents for people in a very everyday way. And because my concern is possibly that in saying to the world, there's something wrong with using the finished device, with using the black box. I mean, in my own experience, I see a lot of people making very successful use of platforms exactly as they are, of smartphones, of Twitter, and using it in a kind of community organization way, or to meet the everyday problems of, getting about life. Is there an issue that we might kind of present another layer of pressure onto people, saying you must hack, you must, change these things you're using, you shouldn't accept them? Is that just yet another social pressure for people who are quite successfully using these products and these platforms?
Yeah, I mean, a black box is easy to use. My brother tried to get my mother to use Linux. It didn't go so well. Using your iPhone or black box is great, and we all used Apple laptops and iPhones and all the rest of it. And the black boxing of systems is required to build more complicated systems. And you can never go down to where you're building circuits out of rocks, You could always go lower and lower level into opening up those black boxes. But the trade-off is that you have much more dependency on the person that designed that. Plus, if there are things like planned obsolescence or dependencies on a bigger corporation, then it can create difficulty. So then opening the black boxes in certain circumstances, I think, can be really valuable. But it's not like we all need to start, making our own toasters, like Thomas Thwaites, which was a great project, by the way. You want to?
Okay. Well, thank you for that answer, and thanks for the questions and for your engagement generally. I think we have to draw it to a close now, so thank you very much to everyone and to the speakers especially.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justin, Garnet and Golan. This morning has all been about tools and platforms. We've heard about how platforms are changing government. We've looked at platforms for citizens, the place of artists in tools and platforms, and we've also heard some of the compelling chains of thought going through this space, and we've asked, what's worth making? What do we need to make? This afternoon, we move to the second part of our theme, which is around unknown futures. And we're bringing together some visionary thinkers from design who are going to explore some of the social scenarios that surround some of these platforms and tools, and also introduce some of the new ways of approaching them. I do have some good news and some bad news. The bad news, as some of you will have seen online, is regretfully Anthony Dunn has had an unavoidable personal issue arise. He sends his apologies and he can't make it. Anthony is without doubt one of the leading thinkers and educators in this space. The good news is we've replaced Anthony with possibly the leading practitioner in this space, and I'm not supposed to embarrass her, so I can say that now because she's not in the room. Anab Jain will be giving the keynote after lunch and opening an afternoon of speculative design and design fiction. If you could thank one more time the panel and then enjoy this fine city for lunch.